six-packs and a big bag of ice. 2 six-packs and a big bag of ice.
Hey, it's Bobby from New Jersey, back for another video, and I've spent a few videos talking about doing keg conversions and cutting the top off and adding accessories and things like that, but I've never done one on modifying a regular kettle or pot, a commercially available pot. Alright, we got an 11 gallon or 44 quart Bayou Classic stainless pot. We're going to be putting a 3-piece ball valve in with a weldless bulkhead. We're going to do a 3-inch dial face thermometer with a 2.5-inch probe, and we're going to put in a weldless sight glass as well. So 3 different accessories, and these are the most common ones that you would put on a boil kettle. So determining placement is the first thing, obviously. You probably want to keep the handles to the sides and put everything on the front of here. It just makes the most sense to me. And a lot of people will center the ball valve and the thermometer just above it, but I find that this makes the operation, well, it's going to be closer to the pot, of course, but it makes the operation a little bit, I don't know, annoying, I guess. One thing that I like to do is center the thermometer, offset the ball valve to the left, and then have the sight glass off to the right. So it puts everything still in the front of the kettle. You have unlimited adjustability on where you want to put your thermometer, and then the ball valve really being off to the side isn't a big deal. It's still very accessible. You know, the handle's off to the side like that. And that's why I put the ball valve on the left, because when the handle's in the closed position, if you had this over here, again, you have that interference issue. Alright, so because I want to put the thermometer dead center, that's the first thing we're going to worry about. So how do we find the center of this pot? What you're going to do is measure, use a cheap measuring tape that'll bend around. Alright, that's 18 inches handle to handle, so the 9-inch mark is the center between the handles, okay? Take a Sharpie marker, make a mark there. So the next thing you do is you take your framing square, lay one side of the square down onto the table, line up your mark that you just made at the top, and then you want to make a mark around this area here, about 6 inches up, and then down here as well. Okay, now we have our center line established. One thing that you can do is measure the total height of your pot. I know that this one is about 17 inches tall, and because I know it's 11 gallons, you can take 11 divided by 17 and you come up with 0.64 gallons per inch. And that's important because when you install your thermometer, regardless of what capacity you have, you got to think about the smallest batch size that you're going to want to do in here. Even if you want to do a 5-gallon batch, when you boil down the 5 gallons, you still want the probe to be submerged. So I figured out that the 6-inch mark up from the bottom is about 3.8 gallons. So if I install that as my center point, I know that I'll be under the 5-gallon mark at all times. Alright, so I'm just going to measure 6 inches up from the bottom. And I'm going to make a mark across that center line at the 6-inch mark. Now that is my center point for drilling that hole. Before I start drilling and making a mess, I want to decide exactly where I'm going to put my ball valve. Now, if this is up here, even offsetting by 3 inches would be beneficial for this, keeping them out of each other's way. Alright, so I'm going to say somewhere around there. Let's just see what that turns out to be. From the center line, it's about 2 1/4. I'm just going to make it, let's call it an even 2 1/2. Alright, so I'm measuring 2 1/2, I'm just going to make a rough vertical line here. Okay, so I know that that's approximately where I'm going to put that. And to determine the height, I'm going to be using a custom dip tube here that has an angled barb on here. And the reason I'm doing this is that this is a really easy and inexpensive dip tube for a pot. It gets more elaborate when you get to a kettle, because, or I should say a converted keg, because it's got to reach down into the lower dish of the keg. But for a pot, it's flat bottomed, and I just expect this to sit inside the pot and come to about, I would say, 1/8 of an inch, or maybe 3/16 off the bottom, just to suck up as much wort as... Now, this could be a hot liquor tank as well. It doesn't really matter that this is a boil kettle, but that way, you know, the opening isn't all the way up here to the point where you have to tip the kettle drastically to get everything to drain out. So I like this integrated elbow or dip tube. It's a poor man's dip tube, basically. So to figure out how high I need to make that hole, I'm going to hold this bulkhead up, and now remember, the thickness of the bottom of the pot is pretty negligible, but I'm going to leave maybe 1/4 inch of space between the bench and the dip tube, and I'll see it this way better. So yeah, about 1/4 inch off the bottom, and I'm going to mark the center line. I'm going to have these two marks intersect. So that'll be my center point to drill for the bulkhead. Okay, so the last thing we need to do is determine the location of the sight glass. I want to make it symmetrical so that the thermometer is down the center and the ball valve and the sight glass are offset by 2.5 inches each. So I'm going to measure 2.5 inches from the center line and make a vertical mark somewhere in that area. Now, to figure out the height off the bottom, that's always a big question about exactly where this thing should sit. You want it to be as low as possible, but there are a couple constraints. One is that you don't want this washer that goes on the inside of the pot to interfere with the curvature where the side wall and the bottom of the pot meet. So that's one consideration. But that still puts it pretty low. You'll get a lot of resolution on the sight glass, probably start reading at about 1 gallon. However, I want to be able to allow for the installation of a heat shield if it ever comes up that that's beneficial for this particular pot. So the best way to do that is to just set your heat shield down on the table or the bench and pop your sight glass fitting into there. And now just let it rest right there. Now that's as far down as I'd want it to go, because if you go any lower, then the heat shield will always hang below the pot, and that makes it awkward when you're moving it around and putting it on tables and things. So that's the very bottom. I'm going to get a little bit more conservative and make my mark about 1/8 of an inch higher than that center line. And that just provides a little bit more insurance just in case the washer wants to hit that curve. It'll just not make it as clean of an install as I would prefer. Okay, but there's my horizontal line and there's my vertical, and I just extend them to my eye's precision and say that that's good. Now, just one more time before I make any holes and sort of commit this pot to what it's going to be, I want to just hold this thermometer up approximately at that mark, and then just make sure that I'm happy with the way that's going to sit. Alright, so we could just make sure that all of the parts are going to be okay. So it looks pretty good to me. One thing I noticed is that it still looks like the sight glass is a little too far left, too close to the center. This is why we take a look, even though we decide that we're going to try to make it offset equally on both sides. It just looks a little bit too heavy to the left. So just use your discretion. I'm just going to move my sight glass over about 1/2 inch to the right. Now, doesn't have to be exact, but that's just my preference. Just going to put a quick X on there. I'll clean it up with some rubbing alcohol later on, but so now that looks a lot better to me. And one last thing I'm going to do before I start drilling, simple enough while we're laying everything out, is to put our plumb line, I should say our square. I'm going to put the edge here on the center point of the sight glass, and I'm just going to make a line up here at the top. Alright, this is going to be where we drill our hole for the eye bolt that stabilizes the sight glass, and it's just easier to put this on here while we don't have any interference on the kettle.